The apology hit her harder than any slap ever had. Ruth Morgan stood in the middle of the dusty street in Caldwell, Kansas, in the blazing summer of 1879, and stared at the man kneeling in the dirt before her. Not kneeling out of weakness, kneeling because he had tripped in his haste to reach her, and he had not bothered to rise. Theodore Hudson, 6 feet 2 inches of sun-bronzed cattleman with hands like iron and eyes the color of a storm rolling over the prairie, looked up at her from the ground and said the words again, slower this time, as though he understood they needed to land. "I am sorry, Ruth. I am truly, deeply sorry for what I said to you." She could not breathe. The street was not empty. Half of Caldwell had watched the argument that had erupted outside the general store not 5 minutes before, the one where Theodore had said something cutting about her competence, about her ability to run the livery she had inherited from her dead father, something sharp and dismissive that she had heard from men her entire life. She had expected him to stand there and let her wilt under it the way every other man always had, the way her father had, the way her ex-husband Frank Morgan had done for 3 brutal years before fever took him. She had expected Theodore Hudson to do what men always did, to dig in, to double down, to act as though the harm he had caused was somehow her fault for being too sensitive about it. She had not expected this. Her hands were trembling at her sides and she did not understand why. She had faced down drunk cowboys with rifles. She had buried her father alone in the January cold of 1876 because the town preacher was too sick to come. She had kept her chin up through 3 years of a marriage that ground her spirit down to powder. Ruth Morgan did not shake, but her hands were shaking now, and the reason was unbearable in its simplicity. No man had ever apologized to her before. Not once in her 27 years of living. She did not know what to do with that. To understand how Ruth Morgan ended up frozen on a Kansas street staring at a man who had just upended everything she thought she knew about the world, you have to go back 6 months, to February of 1879, to the worst blizzard to hit the southern Kansas border in a decade. The Caldwell livery stable had belonged to her father, James Holt, for 22 years before his heart gave out quietly one September morning while he was brushing down a bay gelding. Ruth had received word of his death via a rider who came all the way to Wichita, where she had been living in the cramped rooms above the laundry. She worked for a widow named Mrs. Abernathy. The rider had handed her a folded letter, and she had read it standing up in the street because there was nowhere private to read it. And she had not cried because she and her father had not spoken in 4 years, not since she had married Frank Morgan against James Holt's explicit and loudly stated wishes. Frank Morgan had been exactly the kind of man her father had warned her about, handsome in the way of men who know it and use it as a weapon, charming to strangers and cold to the woman who cooked his meals. He had never struck her. She needed people to understand that, needed it to be clear, because she had watched other women endure worse, and she did not want to claim a suffering that was not precisely hers. But Frank had worn her down in other ways, ways that left no marks, ways that made her question whether the thoughts in her own head were real or mistaken. He had told her constantly, patiently, with the measured tone of a man explaining arithmetic to a slow child, that she was not capable of managing anything beyond the household, that her opinions on money, on business, on the world outside their door were charming but irrelevant, that she ought to leave the thinking to him. When Frank died in the spring of 1877, Ruth had grieved what might have been rather than what was. She had grieved the version of her marriage that had existed only in the hours before she said yes to the proposal. She sold everything they owned, packed a single carpetbag, and took work at the Abernathy laundry in Wichita. She had been there for 2 years when the letter came about her father. The will left her the livery stable, the small house behind it, 3 horses, a mule named Cordelia, and a debt of approximately $80 to the Caldwell Merchant Bank. She almost did not go. She sat in Mrs. Abernathy's kitchen and weighed the options with the careful precision of a woman who has learned that decisions made in haste become regrets carried for years. She could sell the property from a distance, pay the debt, and use whatever remained to buy her way into a different kind of life somewhere. Or she could go to Caldwell, see the place her father had loved better than he had loved her, and try to make something of it. She went to Caldwell because she was 26 years old and she had nothing to lose and no one to consult about it. And those two facts together felt, for the first time in a long while, like freedom. She arrived in Caldwell in November of 1878 on the back of a supply wagon driven by a taciturn man named Gus who said fewer than 20 words during the entire 2-day journey, which suited her perfectly. She had grown very comfortable with silence. Caldwell in November was a town on the cusp of something. It sat right on the Kansas Indian Territory border, a cattle town that breathed dust and profit and danger in equal measure. The cattle trails from Texas brought longhorns and the cowboys who drove them, and the cowboys brought their wages and their appetites, and occasionally their violence. There was a sheriff, a man named Carl Briggs who was competent and fair and generally respected, and there were 2 saloons and a church and a school and a dozen businesses that clung to each other like men in a flood. Ruth arrived and took possession of her inheritance and felt the weight of it settle over her like a second skin. The livery was a good-sized operation. Her father had built it 2 long rows of stalls that could accommodate 20 horses, a tack room lined with pegs and hooks, a forge for simple shoeing work, and the house behind it which was small but solid, with a cast-iron stove that heated the main room adequately and 2 bedrooms that smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather. There was a man named Eli Perkins who had been working for her father for 7 years, a quiet, bow-legged man of about 50 who clearly expected to be dismissed and was visibly startled when Ruth instead asked him to stay on and tell her everything he knew about running the place. Eli knew a great deal. He became, without either of them meaning for it to happen, something close to an ally. The first months were hard in the way that all honest work is hard, which is to say they were exhausting and sometimes discouraging, but never without purpose. Ruth learned to manage accounts, to negotiate rates with the cattle outfits that needed to board their horses, to deal with the particular variety of casual dismissal that Caldwell's businessmen and cowhands offered a woman who presumed to run something as physical and masculine as a livery. She was never rude in return. She had discovered, through the years with Frank and the years before him, that the most effective response to dismissal was not anger but quiet, sustained competence. She simply kept being good at what she did until the dismissal stopped making sense to those doing it. Some of them never came around. Those men she simply did not need. And then February came, with the blizzard, and Theodore Hudson rode into her life in a way that was approximately as dramatic and inconvenient as a man of his nature probably rode into everything. The blizzard arrived on a Thursday afternoon with almost no warning, the kind of storm that the sky announces only with a particular greenish light, and a stillness that the old-timers knew to fear. Ruth had been hauling water from the pump when the air changed, and she had enough sense to get every animal inside before the first wall of snow hit Caldwell like a curtain being drawn across a window. She was still in the stable, making sure every horse was settled and the doors were properly barred, when the big door at the south end burst open, and a man half buried in snow stumbled inside, leading a horse that was in considerably worse shape than he was. "Close that door," Ruth said, because that was the only thing that mattered immediately. The man turned and shoved the door back into its frame with his shoulder and dropped the bar with shaking hands. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, wearing a canvas duster that was now more white than brown, and his hat was pulled low over a face she could not see well in the dim stable light. The horse he had brought in was a chestnut gelding with a left foreleg wrapped in what appeared to be a torn piece of shirt, limping badly. "What happened to the leg?" she asked, moving forward. "Fence wire," the man said. His voice was deep and rough from cold. "Buried under the snow." He stepped into it before I saw it. Ruth was already crouching beside the horse's leg, her hands careful and expert as she unwound the makeshift bandage. The cut was deep, but clean wire cuts always were, and it had bled considerably but appeared to have stopped. She kept her movements steady and spoke quietly to the animal in the way Eli had shown her that horses responded to, low and rhythmic. "He'll need this cleaned and properly dressed," she said, standing. "You can wait out the storm here. There are stalls open in the south row." "I appreciate that," the man said. He pulled off his hat and she got her first clear look at Theodore Hudson. He was somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that had grown slightly long and was now wet with melted snow, a jaw that was square and shadowed with several days of beard, and eyes that were, she would later think, the kind of gray-blue that she associated with weather. He was looking at her with open, frank assessment that was not rude exactly but was thorough. "Theodore Hudson," he said. "Most people call me Theo, but I won't push it." "Ruth Morgan," she said. "I own this livery. Stall rate is 10 cents a night, grain extra." One corner of his mouth moved. "Fair enough." He stayed 3 days, because the blizzard stayed 3 days. And in those 3 days, Ruth Morgan learned several things about Theodore Hudson in the way you learn things about people when a storm forces proximity. He was, first and most obviously, a man of considerable capability. He did not wait to be told what needed doing. He simply did it, moving through the stable with the easy efficiency of someone who had spent much of his life around animals and physical work. He helped feed and water the boarded horses without being asked. He helped Ruth dig out the south door when the snow drifted against it on the second morning. He fixed a broken hinge on one of the stall doors using tools from the tack room, working quietly and precisely, and leaving the workspace cleaner than he had found it. She watched him the way she watched everything carefully, from a certain distance, looking for the trap. Because in Ruth Morgan's experience, men who seemed good always had something hidden. Frank Morgan had seemed good for approximately 6 months after their wedding. Her father had been the most charming, loving man at church every Sunday, and a different creature entirely behind closed doors. Ruth had long since concluded that the pleasantness of men was a kind of performance, and that what lay beneath it was inevitably some version of the same thing, the belief that she existed to serve their comfort and accommodate their convenience. Theodore Hudson gave her no obvious evidence of this, which she found suspicious in itself. On the second evening, with the storm howling against the stable walls and the horses settled in warm rows and the lanterns casting yellow light across the hay-smelling dark, she brought him coffee. She had the fixings in the tack room, which she used as a small office, and he said thank you in a way that sounded like he meant it specifically, not generally. "Where are you from?" she asked, because it was something to say. "Originally, Virginia," he said. "Shenandoah Valley. I left in 1866. "After the war, then." 1866 would have made him young 20 or so when he left. She did not ask about the war directly because no one in 1879 asked about the war directly unless they wanted a conversation that went nowhere good. "And now," she asked. "Now I'm trying to buy land," he said. "There's a ranch about 12 miles east of Caldwell that's been for sale since last fall. The owner died and his sons want the money more than they want the work. I've been in negotiation with the bank for the past 2 months. The Caswell place," she said. "You know it. My father boarded Caswell's horses here for years," she said. "Good land, good water, the house needs work." "Houses can be fixed," he said, and something in the simplicity of that statement made her look at him more carefully. He met her gaze directly, which men rarely did when she was assessing them, because most men could feel the assessment and either bristled at it or looked away. Theodore Hudson did neither. He simply held her gaze with the same easy steadiness he seemed to bring to everything. "How long have you been running this livery?" he asked. "Since November," she said. "It was my father's." "You're doing it well," he said. She waited for the qualifier. But that always came after a compliment from a man. "But the operation must be hard for someone without experience." but you'll need to find a good man to handle the business side. But no but came. She did not know what to do with that either, but she filed it away. By the time the blizzard broke on Friday morning and the world emerged white and blinding and still, Ruth had not let herself think of Theodore Hudson as anything other than a paying customer who happened to be useful in an emergency. She collected his 3-day boarding fee plus the cost of the supplies she had used to treat his horse's leg, and she wrote it out in her ledger in her careful hand, and she expected that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. Theodore came back 2 weeks later, when the snow had melted enough for the roads to be passable, and he paid for another night's boarding for his horse and asked, without particular urgency, whether she might have time to talk with him about the Caswell property. "Why would I know anything useful about the Caswell property?" she said. "Because your father boarded their horses for years," he said, "and because you seem like someone who pays attention." She told him what she knew, which was actually quite a bit. Her father had been a man who talked about his clients, not maliciously but freely, and she had absorbed 22 years of his commentary about the ranchers and farmers and merchants who passed through his stable. She knew the Caswell land had good well water and poor fencing. She knew the south pasture flooded in wet springs. She knew the barn was solid because old Caswell himself had insisted on good lumber when cheaper wood would have done. Theodore listened to all of it with his full attention in a way that she found both uncomfortable and oddly compelling. Frank had never listened to her that way. Her father had never listened to her that way. Listening, in her experience, was something men did while they waited for their turn to talk. Theodore's listening was different. It was active and real, and she could see him storing what she said, weighing it, using it. He came back the week after that, and the week after that. By March, he had purchased the Caswell place from the bank with a combination of cash he had saved over 12 years of trail work and cattle brokering, and a loan he had negotiated down to terms he considered fair. He moved onto the property with the chestnut gelding, whose leg had healed cleanly, and 2 other horses he brought up from a sale in Wichita. He continued to board his horses at Ruth's livery when he came to town, which was often, because the ranch needed supplies and the town needed to be dealt with, and Caldwell was the closest place to the Caswell, the Hudson, now property that had what he required. And every time he came to town, he found a reason to talk to Ruth. She told herself, firmly and repeatedly through March and into April, that she was not thinking about him between visits. This was a lie so transparent that she was mildly ashamed of it. She was absolutely thinking about him between visits, and the nature of her thinking troubled her considerably. She was thinking about the particular quality of his attention. About the fact that when she made a business decision, when she negotiated a contract with a new cattle outfit, or when she decided to spend money on repairs to the north row of stalls rather than let the boards rot further, he responded to her decisions with simple respect rather than with the suggestion that she might want to consult someone more qualified. He treated her judgment as valid. It was a small thing. It should not have meant as much as it did. She was also thinking about the way he looked when he was working with the horses, the ease and confidence of it. She was thinking about a conversation they had in late March when he had asked her what she liked to do when she was not working, and she had said she liked to read, and he had not laughed or looked blank but had instead asked what she was reading. And when she said she had borrowed a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch from the lending library in Wichita before she left, he had said he had read it. And they had talked about it for an hour standing in the doorway of the livery, while the March wind came cold off the plains and neither of them moved to end the conversation. This was dangerous. She knew it was dangerous. She had made one catastrophic choice about a man in her life, and she was not going to make another. She had built something here small and fragile in hers, and she was not going to risk it on a man who was pleasant and attentive now, and might reveal himself to be something else entirely once proximity became obligation. She reminded herself of this regularly through April and into May, and it helped in the way that sensible reminders always help, which is partially and imperfectly. What complicated everything was Nora Hatch. Nora Hatch was the daughter of the man who owned the Caldwell Merchant Bank, a pretty, confident woman of 23 who had decided, somewhere in the early weeks of spring, that Theodore Hudson was the most interesting thing to arrive in Caldwell since the telegraph. Nora was not a villain. Ruth understood that clearly and tried to be fair about it. Nora was simply a woman who knew what she wanted and went after it with cheerful, unabashed determination, and what she wanted, apparently, was Theodore Hudson. She began appearing wherever Theodore appeared, at the general store, at the church social in April, at the spring cattle market in early May where Theodore was buying 2 additional horses, and Ruth happened to be there to register the sale through her livery's boarding contracts. Ruth watched Nora Hatch lean toward Theodore at the cattle market with her parasol tilted just so and her smile at its most polished, and Ruth watched Theodore respond to her with politeness and mild amusement, and Ruth felt something she identified, with a certain disgust at herself, as jealousy. She was jealous of a woman who had done nothing wrong, for a man she had absolutely no claim on and had told herself numerous times she was not going to pursue. The hypocrisy of it was not lost on her. What happened at the cattle market was this. Nora maneuvered Theodore into a conversation Ruth could not hear, and whatever was said during that conversation left Theodore looking slightly trapped and Nora looking satisfied. An hour later, Eli Perkins, who was Ruth's most reliable source of town gossip on account of talking to every single person who ever came through the livery, told her that Nora Hatch had invited Theodore to dinner at the Hatch house the following Friday, and Theodore, apparently unable to find a way out of it that was not rude, had accepted. Ruth went home that evening and cooked herself a meal. She did not taste and read 14 pages of a book she could not afterward recall, and went to sleep at an hour that was frankly embarrassing, and woke up at 3 in the morning with her heart doing something uncomfortable in her chest. She was very annoyed with herself. Theodore came to the livery on the Wednesday before the Hatch dinner to board his horse and pick up some grain, and he was unusually quiet, which she noticed because his ordinary manner was engaged and conversational. She did not ask him about it because she was not going to ask him about the dinner. She had decided that quite firmly. He asked her, apparently out of nowhere, whether she thought a man was obligated to accept every invitation he received. She looked at him. "That depends," she said carefully, "on the nature of the invitation." "A dinner," he said, looking at the horses rather than at her, "from a woman whose company is perfectly pleasant but whose interest is clearly of a particular kind." Ruth measured her words with the precision of someone who knows that what she says next matters. "Then I suppose it depends on whether you share that interest." A silence stretched out between them in the warm, stable air. One of the horses shifted in its stall. Outside, somewhere down the street, a dog was barking. "I find myself," Theodore said, still looking at the horses, "more interested in a different direction." He did not say her name. He did not look at her. But the air between them had changed so completely that the words he had not said were almost louder than the ones he had. Ruth felt her heart do that uncomfortable thing again, only this time it was not uncomfortable in the way of anxiety, but in the way of something trying to open that had been closed for a very long time. She said nothing, because she genuinely did not know what to say, and after a moment Theodore took his grain, paid her, and left. He went to the Hatch dinner on Friday. Ruth knew this because Caldwell was a small town, and small towns breathe information the way lungs breathe air. He was reportedly pleasant throughout the evening and left at 9 o'clock, and did not give Nora any indication that a second invitation would be welcome. The following week he came to the livery on Tuesday morning and stood in the doorway, and looked at Ruth in a way that she felt in her sternum and said, "I'd like to take you to the church social on Saturday, if you're willing." She had been carrying a bucket and she put it down very carefully because her hands had that trembling quality again and she did not want to spill it. "Why?" she said. He tilted his head slightly. "That's an unusual response to an invitation." "I'm an unusual woman," she said. "Why, Mr. Hudson?" Theodore was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Because I have been looking forward to talking to you every week since February, and the conversations are never long enough, and I would like to spend an entire evening finding out what you think about the things that matter." She stared at him. No one had ever said anything remotely like that to her. "The church social is not exactly a setting for the things that matter," she said, because deflection was a skill she had developed over years. "Then it's a start," he said, and his expression was patient and sincere and not performing anything she could detect. "Say yes, Ruth." It was the first time he had used only her first name. It did not sound presumptuous. It sounded like a door opening. "Yes," she said, before the part of her brain that had spent 3 years cataloging the ways men could disappoint could get a word in. The church social was held on the third Saturday of May in the yard behind the First Methodist Church of Caldwell, which in 1879 was a white-painted building with a bell that had been donated by the Caldwell Cattlemen's Association, and a congregation that encompassed about half the town. Tables were set up with food that the women of the congregation brought, and there was a fiddler, and the long evening light of late May turned the whole dusty yard golden. Ruth wore her best dress, which was a dark blue wool that was perhaps more appropriate for autumn than late May, but which was the nicest thing she owned, and she braided her dark hair up with more care than she usually applied. She was 27 years old, and she told herself firmly that she was not nervous. Theodore met her at the livery gate at 5 o'clock, which was when she had told him she would be ready, and she saw his expression shift when he saw her, not overtly, but enough. Something in his face became more still and focused. He was wearing clean clothes, dark trousers and a white shirt and a jacket that had clearly been brushed carefully, and he looked like a man who was trying, which she found endearing despite herself. "You look lovely," he said, and it was not the kind of compliment that required anything from her, just a plain statement that he then moved on from, offering his arm to walk the 3 blocks to the church. The social was enjoyable. Ruth found, to her mild surprise, that she was actually enjoying herself, which was not something she was in the habit of doing at public events. Theodore was easy company in the way of people who are genuinely curious about everything. He talked to the fiddler about his instrument. He talked to the preacher about the spring planting. He talked to old Greta Jensen about her geese in a way that made the old woman laugh for the first time in what Ruth suspected was months. He was interested in people. It was real and unpracticed, and she found it difficult to find fault with. They ate together and then walked the perimeter of the yard in the early dark, and the conversation that evening was the longest and most substantive she had had with another person in years. They talked about the land, about the cattle business, about the politics of the border territory, about what Caldwell might look like in 10 years if the cattle trails shifted as some were predicting they would. They talked about books. He had read more than she had expected, not from formal education, but from years of winters in rough camps with access to nothing but a few well-worn volumes that circulated through bunkhouses. They talked about loss, circling it carefully the way people do when they are not yet sure how much of the truth to give to someone new. He did not push her to say more than she was ready to say. This, too, was unusual. At the end of the evening, he walked her back to the livery gate and said he had had a genuinely good time, and asked if he might call on her again. And she said yes, with only a brief pause in which the cautious part of her and the part of her that had stood in the lamplight of the stable on a blizzard night and thought this man seems real had a very quick argument, and the latter narrowly won. May became June, and the calls continued, twice a week or more, and what was between them deepened the way water deepens a riverbed slowly, and then suddenly. He met her for supper at the boarding-house dining room, which was the closest thing Caldwell had to a proper restaurant. He came to the livery and helped with the kind of heavy work that Eli appreciated an extra pair of hands for, not because anyone asked him to, but because the work was there. He brought her, one afternoon in late June, a copy of Thomas Hardy's Far from the Madding Crowd that he had ordered through the general store's book supplier, and which arrived with a card in his direct, plain handwriting that said only, "I thought you would like Gabriel Oak." She read the book in 3 evenings, and loved it completely, and thought about it more than was probably healthy. She also thought about the fact that Theodore Hudson had, at some point during the spring and early summer, stopped being a man she was watching carefully for the trap, and started being a man she was watching because she wanted to. The distinction mattered. She had not told him about Frank Morgan in any detail. She had mentioned a previous marriage, briefly, the way you mention whether it happened, it's over. She had not told him about the quiet, systematic grinding of those 3 years, the way Frank had made her smaller piece by piece, until she had almost forgotten she had been larger once. She had not told him because she did not yet know how to say it in a way that would not make her sound like she was asking for pity, which she was not, or like she was warning him that she was damaged, which she was not either, or like she was explaining why she was careful, which she was, but which she thought a man like him probably already understood without the explanation. What broke the careful equilibrium of June was entirely her own fault, and she knew it even as it was happening. Theodore came to the livery on the 30th of June to bring his horses in for a few days, while he took a supply run to Wichita. He was talking about a water pump he needed to order for the ranch, something about the capacity of the one that had come with the property being insufficient for the summer stock, and Ruth was only half listening because Eli had, an hour earlier, told her in his roundabout way that a man from town, Dan Calder, who ran the feed store, had gone to Theodore recently with a business proposition. The proposition, according to Eli's account of what he had heard from the blacksmith who had heard it from his cousin, was that Calder wanted to form a supply consortium with Theodore's ranch as the anchor operation, and the consortium would set the prices for livery services in Caldwell as part of its broader market-fixing arrangement. Ruth's livery was specifically mentioned as one of the businesses that would either join the consortium at reduced margin or find itself undercut into closure. Ruth had sat with this information for an hour, and the longer she sat with it, the larger it grew, because she thought she understood why Theodore might have been approached as the anchor. He was the newest and most solvent rancher in the county. His participation would give the consortium legitimacy, and he had been spending a great deal of time with the woman who ran the one livery the consortium most needed to either absorb or destroy. By the time Theodore arrived at the livery on the 30th, she had had an hour to let her thoughts work in the direction that her history with men had trained them to go, and that direction was, he is being pleasant to you because it serves him. The friendship and the attention and the book with the card, all of it is the setup for something that will cost you. He is going to hurt you because that is what men do, and you were foolish enough to let this one get close enough to do real damage. She knew, in the rational part of her mind, that this line of thinking was not necessarily sound. She knew it might be wrong, but knowing something is irrational does not always stop you from feeling it with your whole body. She was cold and short with him in a way she had not been in months, answering his attempts at conversation with single syllables and keeping her back to him as she worked. She felt him notice it and adjust, becoming quieter, watching her with a care that made her angrier for reasons she could not have explained cleanly. Finally he said, "Ruth, did I do something?" "I need to get these stalls done," she said. "Ruth." She turned around because his voice had that quality of a man who is not going to be politely deflected, and she looked at him and said flatly, "Did Dan Calder come to see you about a supply consortium?" Something moved across his face. "He did," he said. "And is my livery included in that arrangement?" A pause. "Calder mentioned you. He mentioned several businesses." Ruth set down the pitchfork she had been holding with a steadiness she did not feel. "I see," she said. "What do you think you see?" Said, and his voice was careful rather than defensive, which she noticed even through the cold current of her suspicion. "I think I see a man who has spent 6 months being friendly with a woman who runs a business he may have an interest in influencing." she said, and each word came out precisely, and with the control of someone who has rehearsed being calm about things that are not calm. And I think that is a thing I should have considered more seriously before now. The silence after that was very loud. She watched Theodore's face. She watched him absorb what she had said and what it implied about what she thought of him and what she thought of the past 6 months. She watched something shift in his expression, not to anger, which would have been easier to deal with, not to the cold withdrawal she had seen in Frank when confronted, but to something more complicated, something that looked, she thought, like hurt. "I see," he said quietly. "Is that genuinely what you think?" "I am telling you what I cannot rule out," she said, because honesty mattered more to her than softness. Theodore was quiet for a moment. He put his hat on the hitching post by the stall door, and he looked at the ground, and then he looked at her. And something in his look was so entirely without performance that it was almost hard to look at directly. "I told Dan Calder no," he said. 3 days ago. I told him I had no interest in a consortium that worked by squeezing out the smaller operations, and I specifically told him that if he approached you or Eli Perkins with any kind of pressure arrangement, I would take the matter to Sheriff Briggs. Ruth stared at him. "I should have told you about the meeting immediately," he said. "I made a choice not to because I did not want to worry you about something I had already resolved, and that was the wrong decision. You had a right to know, and I should have trusted you with it. I'm sorry for that." The apology landed in the middle of the livery like something dropped from a great height. Ruth looked at him. She looked at his hands, which were still, not fidgeting, not performing anything. She looked at his face, which was open and direct, and doing the thing it always did, which was simply existing without pretense. "I am sorry, Ruth," he said again, as though he thought perhaps the first time had not been real enough. "I handled that badly, and you deserved better." That was the moment. That was the moment she had not prepared for and did not know how to receive. No man had ever apologized to her before, not once, not in 27 years, not her father. Not Frank, who had once broken a promise so fundamental that she had spent a week unable to eat, and who had responded to her grief about it with the patient explanation that she had misunderstood the nature of the promise to begin with. Not any of the men in her life who had dismissed her and diminished her and explained to her, repeatedly, the ways in which she was wrong about her own experience. Theodore Hudson was on one knee in the livery, not because it was romantic, but because he had tripped on a loose board on the way toward her, and he was looking up at her, and he had said sorry and meant it, and she did not know what to do. She walked out of the stable, not running, walking. Deliberately, because she was Ruth Morgan and she did not run. She walked out the south door of the livery and into the street, and she stood there in the June sun with her hands at her sides, trembling. Theodore came out after her. He was careful enough not to grab her arm or put himself in front of her. He came and stood beside her, near enough that she was aware of him, and he did not speak. The street went about its business. A wagon rolled past loaded with timber. 2 women crossed the road ahead toward the dry goods store. A dog investigated something under the porch of the bootmaker's shop. Caldwell, in the afternoon, was indifferent to the revolution happening inside Ruth Morgan. "You really told him no," she said. "Not a question, confirmation." "I really told him no," Theodore said. "Before or after you knew I had heard about the meeting?" "Long before," he said. "The night after the meeting, I sat up and thought it through, and I knew I wasn't interested in what he was proposing, and I told him the next morning. You hearing about it this week is how rumors travel in a small town. They don't travel fast enough for it to have gone the other way." She thought about this. The logic of it was sound. 3 days ago meant he had turned Calder down before she had known there was anything to turn down. He had done it without any reason to do it other than that it was the right thing. "I accused you of using me," she said, and her voice was steady but flat, the way her voice got when emotion was pressing up behind it with significant pressure. "You did," he said. "I was wrong," she said. This cost her something, not because admitting wrongness was unfamiliar, but because she had spent so long defending herself against being wrong about the thing that was actually right, and she needed to be precise now. "You were working with the information you had and the experience you've had," he said quietly. "You weren't wrong to question it. The only thing that was wrong was my not telling you sooner." She turned to look at him. He was standing very still in the sun, his hat in his hand, his dark hair slightly disheveled from having run his fingers through it, which he did when he was thinking hard. His expression was patient and steady, and she thought, for perhaps the first time since she had known him, that she was completely certain about what she saw in it. There was no hidden layer. There was no calculation beneath the surface. There was just a man who had done the right thing, and then apologized for the small part of it he had not done well enough, and was waiting. "I don't know how to do this," she said, and it came out more honestly than she had intended, but once it was out she didn't take it back. "Do what?" he said. "Trust a man," she said. I have had very little evidence that it is a sound approach." Theodore was quiet for a long moment. A horse went past in the street. The sun was hitting the dust and making it shimmer. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to trust me all at once. That's not how trust works anyway. You test it in small things until you have enough experience to extend it further. I'm asking you to keep giving me the chance to give you that experience." She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that another woman might have been embarrassed by the scrutiny, or he might have been. He was not. "All right," she said. The summer deepened and the air between them deepened with it. They fell into a rhythm that was both entirely natural and quietly extraordinary. His visits to the livery and the town, the suppers and the social evenings, and the long conversations that had become the thing she looked forward to most across any given week. She told him in July about Frank Morgan. Not everything, not all at once, but enough that he understood the shape of it, the years of slow diminishment, and the particular loneliness of being made to feel invisible by the one person who had committed to seeing you. Theodore listened to all of it the way he listened to everything, completely. He did not try to fix it or reframe it or tell her that perhaps Frank had meant well. He said at the end of it that he was sorry it had happened to her, and that he thought she had been extraordinarily strong to come through it and build what she had built. He said it plainly, without drama, and then he asked if she wanted more coffee, and the normalcy of the question after the weight of what had been said was exactly right. She told him, in August, about her father. This was harder than Frank. Frank had been a choice she had made and regretted, but her father was something older and more complicated. She told Theodore about the man James Holt had been, the charm and the coldness, the love that was real but conditional, the ways he had made her feel that her mind and her wants were interesting curiosities rather than things to be taken seriously. She told him about the years they had not spoken. She told him that she had stood at her father's grave in the cold of November and felt grief and relief in equal measure, and had not known who she was supposed to be in the aftermath of both. Theodore was quiet for a long time after that. They were sitting on the porch of his ranch house. She had ridden out to the Hudson place for the first time in late August, a Sunday afternoon when the heat was fierce, but the light was beautiful, and the land stretched out around them in the golden last-of-summer way that made Kansas look like it had been painted by someone who felt strongly about the color amber. "My father was difficult too," he said finally, "in a different way. He was a man who believed that love had to be earned constantly, that you had to justify your place in the family through performance. The war changed things, it changed him and it changed me, and the men we were afterward could barely recognize the men we had been before. I left because I needed to go find out who I was when there wasn't someone telling me I was doing it wrong." She looked at him in the amber light. "Did you find out?" "Mostly," he said. "I think the last few things I needed to know are things I'm finding out now." He was looking at her when he said it, and she let herself hold his gaze fully for the first time, without the small, protective distance she usually maintained. She let him see her looking at him and what it meant. He reached across the space between their chairs and put his hand over hers, not gripping, just covering. His hand was warm and solid and careful. "Ruth," he said. "I know," she said. They sat that way in the amber light for a long time, and neither of them needed to say anything else, because the thing that had been building since a blizzard night in February was there between them now, fully formed and real. He kissed her for the first time that evening as she was leaving, standing at her horse's head, where he had come to hold the bridle while she mounted. He asked first, quietly, with his eyes, and she answered the same way, and it was the simplest and most complete thing she had felt since she could remember. She rode home in the deep blue of the August evening with her heart very full and her head very quiet, and she thought that this specific quality of being seen and known and treated with care, was what she had not known she was missing until she had it. September in Caldwell brought the last of the season's cattle drives, the big herds coming up from Texas on the Kishom Trail, and the town swelled briefly with drovers and trail bosses, and the particular energy of men at the end of a long road with money in their pockets. Ruth's livery was full, and she and Eli worked long hours, and she was grateful for the business and also grateful when October came, and the volume settled back to normal. Theodore had begun to talk, cautiously and seriously, about what the future might look like. Not in the vague, aspirational way of men who use the future as a comfortable country they intend to visit someday, but concretely, what improvements the ranch needed, what markets he was building toward, what kind of operation he wanted to have in 5 years. He talked about it with her as though her opinion was integral to the planning, not as a courtesy but as a genuine consultation. One afternoon in early October, sitting in the livery office while she went through the month's accounts, and he waited for a horse he had left to be shod at the blacksmith next door, he said, without particular preamble, "I've been thinking about whether you'd consider keeping the livery if we were married." Ruth looked up from the accounts. He met her look with his steady gray-blue gaze, and something in his expression that was both certain and certain of what he wanted to ask, open about the possibility that her answer might be no. "I've thought about it from every angle," he said, "and my conclusion is that the livery is yours and it should stay yours. You built it into what it is. I would not ask you to give that up." She put down the pencil she had been holding. "You're asking me to marry you." "I'm asking you to think about marrying me," he said. "If you want to think about it, I don't want you to feel pressured." "Theodore," she said. "Yes. I have been thinking about marrying you since August," she said. Something in his face broke open in the best possible way. The steadiness was still there, but something under its surface, joy, clean and real and unperformed. "Then yes," he said. "Yes," she said, "with the understanding that the livery stays mine." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said, and meant it. They were married in the First Methodist Church of Caldwell on the 4th of November, 1879, exactly 1 year and 1 week after Ruth had arrived in town on the back of Gus's supply wagon with a carpet bag and a debt, and the beginning of something she had not yet been able to name. The ceremony was attended by half the town, which in Caldwell in 1879 meant approximately 90 people, and the reception was held in the churchyard with tables of food and the same fiddler who had played at the spring social, where Ruth had first let herself stop watching for the trap. Eli Perkins stood up with Theodore as something between a best man and a witness, because the two of them had developed, over the months of Theodore's frequent visits to the livery, the specific kind of friendship that forms between practical men who respect each other's competence without needing to discuss it. Greta Jensen, the old woman with the geese, sat in the front row and wept contentedly throughout the ceremony, and told everyone afterward that she had known from the moment she saw them together at the spring social. Ruth wore a dress she had made with the help of Sarah Clark, the seamstress who had her shop on Main Street, from a pale gold fabric she had found in the general store's dry goods section, and thought was too beautiful to be practical for anything, and then decided that her wedding was the appropriate occasion for something too beautiful to be practical. Theodore, when he saw her walking up the church aisle, lost his composed expression entirely for approximately 15 seconds before recovering it, and she was glad she had chosen the gold. The words they said to each other were the standard words of the Methodist ceremony, but when Theodore said "I will" and looked at her, she felt the weight of those two words carry everything he had shown her over the past year. The patience, the honesty, the apologies given without hesitation, the respect that was not a performance but a principle. She said her own "I will" and felt, for the first time in her adult life, that she was saying yes to something that was entirely real. They moved between the two properties, the house behind the livery and the ranch house 12 miles east, with a fluid, practical logic that suited them both. Ruth kept the livery operation, with Eli running the daily management on the days she was at the ranch. Theodore continued to build the Hudson Ranch into what he had envisioned, and she was part of that planning as she had always been, not as a wife performing advisory interest, but as a partner who had actual knowledge and judgment about the livestock and supply chains that were the backbone of the operation. The first winter of their marriage was the kind of winter that proves people to each other. Theodore learned, in the specific intimacy of shared life, things about Ruth that she had never told anyone, the nightmares that came sometimes, remnants of the frank years, not dramatic, just the particular kind of dream where you are small and certain you are wrong about everything. He learned them because he woke up when she did and stayed awake with her, not making a performance of it, just being present until the dark settled back into ordinary dark. Ruth learned things about Theodore that the careful, measured quality of courtship had not shown her, the way he carried old silences from the war years, things he did not talk about but that lived in him. She learned that the steadiness he presented to the world cost him something to maintain, that there were mornings when he was fighting something internal that he did not name, and that she came to recognize and learn to move around carefully, giving him space without distance, which is a particular skill that she had developed not in any previous relationship, but specifically in response to knowing him. They learned each other, which is both the simplest and the most complex thing two people can do. By the spring of 1880, Ruth was carrying their first child, which she announced to Theodore on a March morning while they were having breakfast in the ranch house kitchen, and he was reading a letter about the spring cattle market in Abilene. He put the letter down very carefully and looked at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. "A baby," he said, as though the word needed to be tested to be real. "A baby," she confirmed. He came around the table and knelt beside her chair. He was not graceful about it. He caught his knee on the table leg and muttered something quiet and uncharacteristic that made her laugh, and he took both her hands in his and held them in the way he had that first evening in August, careful and warm and certain. "Are you well?" he said, because that was the first thing always with Theodore, not "what does this mean for me," but "how are you?" "I'm very well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but very well." A son was born in November of 1880, on a cold afternoon that arrived with considerably more haste than anyone, including the doctor, had prepared for. Theodore was present for the birth, which was not common for men of that time and place, but Ruth had been absolutely clear that she wanted him there, and he had not for a moment suggested otherwise. He held her hand through the worst of it and did not flinch and did not leave. The boy was born with a full head of dark hair and Theodore's gray-blue eyes, and an expression of profound outrage at existence that both parents found immediately endearing. They named him James, after Ruth's father, not as a sentimental gesture toward a man who had not always deserved it, but because the name belonged to the land and the livery and the thing her father had built, and Ruth wanted to reclaim it. James Hudson. She said the name the first morning and thought it was exactly right. Eli Perkins, who had no children of his own and who had become by that point something between an employee and a family member, arrived at the ranch the morning after the birth with a carved wooden horse he had made over the winter. He presented it to Theodore with the brief comment that he supposed the boy would be needing something to hold onto in a few years, which was as close to open sentimentality as Eli got, and Theodore shook his hand, and Ruth, from the bedroom where she was feeding the baby, heard the exchange, and felt her chest full with the particular warmth of a life that had turned out to contain good people. Dan Calder's consortium attempt had largely collapsed by early 1880, partly because Theodore's refusal had removed the legitimacy it needed, and partly because Sheriff Briggs had indeed been informed, and had let it be known quietly that certain business arrangements of a price-fixing nature were not going to be welcomed in Caldwell. Calder himself sold the feed store in the spring and moved on, which the town absorbed without notable grief. Nora Hatch found herself, by the summer of 1880, significantly interested in a young lawyer named Aldous Green, who had set up a practice in Caldwell following his bar admission in Topeka. Ruth saw her in town occasionally and found that the jealousy she had felt in May of 1879 had been so thoroughly resolved by everything that followed it that it was almost impossible to locate. She was genuinely happy for Nora, who deserved a man who was entirely interested in her direction, and who had found one. Theodore began, in 1881, to expand the ranch in the direction they had planned to gather more horses, a small cattle operation. A second hired man named Joseph Webb, who was a young man from Missouri, with a talent for horses that Theodore recognized immediately, and nurtured the way he nurtured anything he found worth investing in. The Hudson Ranch became, over the following years, one of the solid, reputable operations in the county, not the largest, not the most dramatic, but well-run and honest, and with a reputation for fair dealing that Theodore had built piece by piece and defended without exception. Ruth's livery continued to thrive. She made improvements in 1881, added 4 additional stalls and a proper forge, and hired a young woman named Clara as an assistant, which raised some eyebrows in Caldwell, until Clara turned out to be so good at the work that the eyebrows lowered again, in the particular way that sustained competence always eventually defeats preconceptions. Eli remained, carrying his irreplaceable institutional knowledge into the new decade with the steady dedication that was his nature. Their second child came in the autumn of 1882, a daughter this time, which they had not asked for specifically but received with complete joy. They named her Margaret, after Theodore's mother, who had died in 1874, and whom he spoke of with a simplicity of love that told Ruth everything she needed to know about the woman and about the boy who had become this man. Margaret arrived into the world with her mother's dark hair and an expression of intense interest in everything around her that she maintained, as far as anyone could tell, indefinitely. James at 2 was already fascinated by horses with a depth that delighted his parents and occasionally alarmed them, particularly when he escaped from supervision, and was found in the livery stall with the most placid of the boarded animals, attempting a conversation. Theodore would find him there and not immediately remove him, but crouch beside him and explain, in the measured way he explained everything, the important things about being near a large animal and what respect looked like in practice. James listened, with an attention that was unmistakably his father's. Margaret, as she grew, was her mother's daughter in the specific way of minds that work continuously and quickly and need things to work on. Ruth taught her to read early and well, and Margaret consumed books with the same appetite Ruth had always had, and their conversations as Margaret grew were among the things Ruth treasured most. Two minds that worked similarly, finding each other across the breakfast table or the livery yard or the porch of the ranch house, following a thought to its end, because neither of them was willing to leave it half-finished. The 1880s brought change to Caldwell and to Kansas more broadly. The cattle drives began to wind down as the decade progressed. The expansion of the railroad changed the economics of driving cattle north from Texas, and by the mid-1880s, the great herds that had sustained Caldwell's particular economy were becoming less frequent. Theodore had seen this coming and had diversified the ranch accordingly, moving more toward horse breeding and grain farming in the years when the cattle trade was still reliable enough to fund the transition. Ruth adapted the livery's focus as well, shifting from the large-scale boarding that the cattle drives had generated toward a more stable local client base and a new service, the hire and sale of quality working horses, which Joseph Webb managed with the skill and honesty that had made him indispensable. Clara had become, by 1883, effectively the livery's operations manager, which Eli accepted with grace and Ruth with satisfaction. On a Saturday afternoon in October of 1884, Ruth sat on the porch of the ranch house with Theodore and watched James, now 4, chase Margaret, now 2, around the yard in a game whose rules appeared to exist only in James's imagination, and which Margaret was fully committed to despite this. The late afternoon light was long and gold, the way Kansas light got in October when the sky was high and clear, and the land around them was the amber of harvested fields and turning grass. Theodore had his arm around her shoulders in the easy, habitual way of people who have been comfortable with each other for years. She had her feet up on the porch rail, which she did when she was relaxed and which she had trained herself not to apologize for. "Are you happy?" he asked, not as a routine question. He asked it sometimes in the direct, real way that she had learned meant he genuinely wanted to know the state of things, internally, the way you ask about the weather because you are actually going outside and need the truth. She thought about it seriously, the way he always asked her to think about things. She thought about November of 1878, the carpetbag and the debt, and the cold November light on the livery she had not yet decided to keep. She thought about the blizzard and the man who had stumbled through the door with a wounded horse. She thought about months of careful watching, and the moment when careful watching had given way to something else, something she had not trusted herself to name for a long time because she had been so thoroughly trained to disbelieve in good things. She thought about an apology, offered clean and without defense, in the middle of a livery stable, from a man on one knee who had tripped on a loose board. She thought about what it had cost her to receive that apology. The way it had undone something that had been tightly wound for years, the way it had required her to reconsider what she had always assumed was simply true about men and about the world and about what she deserved. She thought about James in the livery stall talking to the patient horse. She thought about Margaret's face in the lamplight when a story she was reading turned out better than she expected. She thought about Eli Perkins' carved wooden horse and the matter-of-fact way he had presented it, as though it were obvious that some things were worth making by hand. She thought about the October light in Theodore's arm and the way the land around them was theirs in the real sense, not just legally, not just on paper, but in the sense that they had shaped it and it had shaped them and neither could quite be separated from the other anymore. "Yes," she said, fully and without reservation. "I am happy." He pressed a kiss to her temple, unhurried and warm, and they watched their children in the amber light. In the spring of 1885, Ruth found out she was carrying a third child, and told Theodore over supper on an April evening with the same directness she applied to everything. He smiled in the wide, unguarded way that domestic happiness had made more frequent in him, the expression that was so different from the controlled steadiness he had first shown her, and she loved both versions, the careful, strong one she had met in the blizzard and the open, easy one she had helped make possible. The third child was born in December of 1885, a second son whom they named William after Theodore's older brother, who had been killed in the war at the age of 22, and whose memory Theodore carried the way survivors carry the people they could not bring home. William was born with his father's dark hair and a temperament so placid and sunny that it seemed to be a deliberate counterpoint to his sister's intensity and his brother's restlessness. He was a baby who seemed fundamentally at ease with existence, which his parents found both astonishing and deeply charming. Caldwell changed around them through the late 1880s. The cattle economy continued its decline, and some businesses closed, and some families moved on to newer territories, following whatever the latest promise was. The Hudson livery and the Hudson ranch did not close, and the Hudsons did not move on, because they had built something specific in this place, and specific things resist the general current. Eli Perkins retired in 1887, at an age he estimated as somewhere between 60 and 65, since he had never been certain of his exact birth year. He moved into a small house at the east edge of town that Ruth and Theodore helped him purchase, and he continued to come to the livery 3 mornings a week because, as he put it, he had forgotten how to not work and saw no reason to learn. Ruth welcomed this and paid him for those 3 mornings because Eli's knowledge was still worth more than most people's full weeks, and because the arrangement suited them both perfectly. Clara ran the livery now with the full authority of someone who had earned it completely. She had married Joseph Webb in 1886, a courtship conducted largely at the livery and the ranch, to the private amusement of both Ruth and Theodore, who recognized their own story in its careful, watchful, eventually inevitable arc. And the two of them were building their own version of the life that Ruth had learned it was possible to build. In the summer of 1888, Theodore brought Ruth out to the far east pasture of the ranch on a Sunday morning under the pretense of looking at a section of fencing he thought needed replacing. She saw immediately that the fencing was entirely fine, and was about to say so when she noticed that he had, at some point, arranged a blanket and a basket under the single large cottonwood tree that stood at the edge of the pasture and cast good shade. She looked at the tree and the blanket, and then she looked at him. "The fence is not broken," she said. "The fence is completely fine," he agreed, with the particular quality of suppressed amusement that she loved most on him. They sat under the cottonwood and ate and talked with the ease of 8 years of marriage, the comfort of it, the specific pleasure of a conversation with someone whose mind you know as well as you know your own, and who still, regularly, says something that surprises you. He told her that he had been thinking about the past decade, the 10 years since a blizzard had pushed him through the door of her livery, and that he had been trying to find words adequate to what those years had been. "And did you find them?" she said. "Approximately," he said. He looked at the cottonwood and the sky and then at her. "I know what my life was before Caldwell. I know what it cost me in terms of loneliness, even when I didn't let myself call it that. I know that I had gotten very good at being competent and very poor at being known." He paused. "You changed that. You are the only person in my life who has ever known me in the particular way you do, where I don't have to manage what you see, where being real is not a risk." Ruth sat with this. She thought about the man she had been so carefully watching for the trap. She thought about the version of herself who had stood in the June street and trembled because she did not know what to do with an apology. "You were the first man who ever apologized to me," she said. "I was standing in the livery holding the pitchfork and you told me what you had done and then said you were sorry. I walked out because I didn't know how to receive it. I had not been given the tools for it." "I know," he said gently. "I didn't tell you that at the time," she said. "No, but I want you to know it now," she said, "because it matters to what came after. That moment, that specific moment of being given something I didn't know how to hold was the beginning of actually trusting you. Not because the apology was extraordinary in itself, but because it was real. Because you did not defend yourself or redirect it back at me. You just said you were sorry and let it be true." She looked at him directly, holding nothing back. "That was everything, Theodore. That was the whole hinge of it." Theodore held her gaze the way he always had, completely, without flinching. "Then I am glad," he said simply. "I am very glad I said it." She reached across and put her hand over his, reversing the gesture he had made that first evening in August, all those years ago. His hand turned under hers and held. They sat under the cottonwood in the summer morning, while the pasture grass moved in the wind and the horses grazed in the distance, and the fence stood entirely unbroken, and the sky was very blue over the Kansas plains. James, at 8, was already the person he was going to be, serious and capable and deeply, practically compassionate toward animals, in a way that suggested his future was written in clear letters. Margaret, at 6, could read faster than most adults in Caldwell, and regularly beat her father at checkers, which he had never once let her win, and which she had won entirely on her own merits, a fact that gave both of them equal satisfaction. William, at 2, continued his sunny, equanimous assessment of the world, apparently concluding on a daily basis that things were fundamentally good. In 1889, Kansas achieved statehood for various internal territories, and the broader landscape of the plains shifted further, and Caldwell continued to evolve into a less wild, more settled version of itself. This was loss and gain in equal measure: the loss of the particular edge that a cattle frontier town had, the gain of the stability that came with roads and schools, and the slow, patient accumulation of community. Sheriff Briggs retired in 1888, and his replacement, a younger man named Henderson, was competent and forward-looking in the way of the next generation. The Hudson children grew up in the particular way of children who are loved specifically, not in the general, ambient way of children whose parents are decent but distracted, but in the precise, attentive way of parents who know their children as individuals and take them seriously. Ruth taught Margaret to ride and to handle accounts and to speak her mind in a room full of people who expected her to be quiet. Theodore taught James to work with horses and to build things and to say "I'm sorry" when he was wrong and mean it when he said it. They taught William, who was inclined to gentleness by nature, that gentleness was a strength and not an apology for the absence of strength. On a September evening in 1890, with the children in bed and the ranch house quiet in the way it got on autumn evenings when the nights came earlier, and the crickets were loud, and the air was the temperature of something exactly between day and night, Ruth and Theodore sat on the porch in the blue dark, and she told him that she thought she was done carrying children, and he said that he thought so too, and they talked about it with the frank, honest ease that they brought to everything. And at the end of the conversation, he said that what they had built was so far beyond what he had thought was possible for his life that any measure of it was adequate. Even with everything hard, he said. The bad winters and the bad years, the market that dropped in '86 and we had to sell off horses we didn't want to sell, your father's death and what that cost you even while you were managing it. Even with all of it, she said. Then we agree, he said. We nearly always do, she said, which was true in the specific way that two people who are genuinely similar in what they value and genuinely different in how they think tend to agree on what matters and argue productively about the how of it, and whose arguments are therefore generative rather than destructive. The livery passed, in the mid-1890s, into the capable hands of Clara and Joseph Webb, through a sale arranged with such care and fairness that it was essentially a gift with paperwork. Ruth was in her early 40s, and the years of physical work had settled into a different kind of engagement. She remained on the board of the Caldwell Merchant Association, which had been reorganized after Calder's consortium attempt into something transparent and broadly representative, and she advised Clara on the business side with the pleasure of someone sharing knowledge they have earned. Theodore's ranch had become, by the mid-1890s, the kind of operation that younger ranchers came to look at for models of what could be done with honest work and long-term thinking. He was not a wealthy man by the standards of the large cattle barons, but he was prosperous and stable and respected, and those things suited him considerably better than wealth without them would have. James, at 15, was already spending his summers working with the horses in the way of a young man who has found his purpose early and is grateful rather than constrained by it. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's steadiness, and a particular quality of quiet authority with animals that was entirely his own. Theodore watched him work sometimes with an expression. Ruth recognized the expression of a father seeing the best of what he hoped to be reflected back with its own additional light. Margaret at 13 was, as Ruth had always suspected she might be, a serious complication to the assumptions of Caldwell's school system, which was not fully equipped for a student who had read everything the school library contained and was beginning to identify its errors. Ruth went to the school board in 1893 and had a conversation with them about Margaret's situation that resulted in Margaret being given access to the county lending library, in addition to the school's resources, and also being allowed to correspond with a teacher in Wichita who ran a supplemental program for advanced students. The school board was, Ruth later said, somewhat more cooperative than she had expected, and Theodore said he thought that was possibly because she had walked in there with the expression of someone who had a firm and non-negotiable position, and was extending the courtesy of giving them the chance to arrive at it themselves. William, at 9, was the most social creature any of them had ever known, with the particular gift of making everyone around him feel included and at ease, which made him the center of every group of children he was near, and which made adults who did not know him find his company unexpectedly calming. He had decided he wanted to be a doctor, which announcement he made at the dinner table one Sunday evening with the serene certainty of someone reporting established fact. Theodore and Ruth exchanged the look that parents who know each other extremely well exchange across a dinner table, and both of them said, in approximately the same moment, that it sounded entirely right for him. Ruth Morgan Hudson, legally, though she used both names in professional contexts because the livery would always be the Morgan livery in her mind, and in the towns sat at her kitchen table one morning in the autumn of 1895 and wrote a letter to her sister, Eleanor, who had moved to Colorado in 1881 and whom she had not seen in 7 years, but with whom she maintained a correspondence that was one of the steady pleasures of her life. In the letter she tried to explain what the years had been, the truth of them, not the manageable summary she usually offered when people asked how she was doing. She wrote about the way fear can calcify inside a person and become indistinguishable from good sense, until someone comes along who gives you the specific experience that makes you question the calcification. She wrote about an apology, offered in a livery stable in the summer of 1879, that had been the first honest moment of receiving care that she could remember. She wrote about learning, slowly and with considerable difficulty, how to hold good things without immediately looking for where they would break. She wrote, "I did not know, for most of my life, that a relationship could be a place where you grew larger rather than smaller. I had evidence only for the other kind. Theodore gave me different evidence. He did it patiently and over time, and without ever making me feel that the caution I brought to it was an obstacle he was irritated by. He treated my protection of myself as reasonable, and then he gave me reasons, one at a time, to protect myself less, until I found that I did not need the protection from him at all, and that this was not naivety but something earned." She sealed the letter and walked to the post office in the September morning light, past the main street of a Caldwell that was smaller and quieter than the one she had arrived in, but was more fully hers for all the years she had lived in it. She walked past the livery, Clara's livery now, but with the same building her father had built and the same good smell of hay and horse and honest work, and past the general store where she had faced Theodore in the argument that had ended in the street, and the apology and the trembling. She stood for a moment in front of the spot in the street where she had stood that June afternoon in 1879, 27 years old, and having no idea what to do with kindness, and she thought about the woman she had been in that moment, rigid with self-protection and wounded by history, and entirely unequipped for what was happening. She liked that woman. She was grateful for her, even for the caution and the suspicion that had made things harder, because those things had come from real experience and had kept her whole until wholeness became possible with someone who deserved it. She mailed the letter and walked home through the autumn morning. Theodore was at the kitchen table when she returned, working through a correspondence with a horse buyer from Wichita who was interested in 3 of the young mares they had bred that spring. He looked up when she came in, in the way he always looked up, completely, as though what had his attention before she entered was secondary to her presence. 16 years of marriage had not changed that, and she thought it would probably not change in the years they had left. "Letter sent," he said. "Letter sent," she said. She poured herself coffee and sat down across from him and looked at the morning light on the kitchen table and the man on the other side of it and the particular, ordinary, extraordinary reality of a life that had turned out to be exactly the right one. "Eleanor will write back wanting details," she said. "She always does," he said. What did you tell her? Ruth thought about the letter, about the things she had tried to put into words on the plain paper. "I told her the truth," she said. "About how it started and what it cost and what it became." Theodore considered this, the way he considered everything fully, without rushing. "And how did it become?" he asked. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the morning light of 1895, with the sound of James in the yard, and Margaret in her room reading and William somewhere being the center of someone's world, and the livery she had kept, and the ranch they had built, and the years they had spent in the particular work of becoming fully known to each other. "It became everything," she said. "It became the whole of what I wanted and could not have asked for because I did not have the words for it yet." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the gesture as familiar now as breathing and as deliberate as it had ever been. "Good," he said. And she heard in that single word all the years of it. The blizzard door and the apology and the August light and the gold dress and the children and the land and the long, real, continuously expanding thing they had made together out of two people who had both arrived, in their different ways, needing to be shown that honesty between people was possible, and who had shown it to each other, one true thing at a time, until there was no distance left between who they were and who they let each other see. The cottonwood in the far east pasture was still there. They could see it from the kitchen window on clear days, standing at the edge of the pasture where the land opened out toward the horizon, reaching its particular unhurried height against the Kansas sky. It would be there long after them, Ruth thought, long after all of it. Trees did not need to be told they were worthwhile. They simply grew toward whatever light was available and let their roots go deep and continued. She thought that was about right. She thought that was, in fact, exactly right.